Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Sunday, May 10th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. Today in Riverside, we are looking at a mild high of 72.6 degrees and a low of 59.4. It is a wonderful Sunday to celebrate all the mothers in our lives, so happy Mother's Day to those listening. On today's program, we are going to investigate how a convicted felon was able to acquire the firearm used in the tragic death of 8 children. We are also looking into the legal defense of the driver who struck a group of sheriff recruits, specifically their recent pivot to a seizure-based argument. Beyond these reports, we will have a look at other important stories from around the globe. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Good morning, everyone. We're starting today with a heartbreaking story out of Louisiana, where a community is grieving the loss of 8 young children. Joining us now is our reporter Ethan, who's been following this story closely. Ethan, good morning.
Good morning, Grace. Yes, this is a story that has truly shaken the city of Shreveport and really the entire country. Yesterday, on May 9th, 2026, hundreds of mourners gathered at Summer Grove Baptist Church to say goodbye to 8 children. The community has come to call them the Eternal 8, and the funeral fell on Mother's Day weekend, which made it all the more devastating.
Just a gut-wrenching scene. Ethan, can you walk us through what the memorial service actually looked like?
It was incredibly moving, Grace. According to NY1 and ABC News, the service began with a long, tearful procession as mourners filed past 8 small white caskets. Each casket was adorned with a gold crown and bouquets of white flowers, and large framed photographs of the children were placed alongside them. NY1 reported that faith leaders and politicians offered words of comfort to what they called a battered city.
And these were very young children. Tell us a little more about who they were.
They ranged in age from just 3 to 11 years old. 7 of them were siblings, and 1 was their cousin. The oldest was Soraya Snow, who was 11. Then there was Mark Hayden Pugh, 10 years old, known to family as K-Bug, and he was the cousin. Layla Pugh was 7, described in the funeral pamphlet as, quote, bright, intelligent, bold, and full of love, end quote, and she loved making TikTok videos with her family.
That detail about TikTok really brings her to life. Who were the other children?
There was Kadarion Snow, who was 6, remembered for a sweet and loving heart. Kayla Pugh was also 6, affectionately nicknamed K-May. Then Shayla Elkins, who was 5, and Braylon Snow, also 5. And the youngest victim, Grace, was Jayla Elkins, just 3 years old, nicknamed J-Bay. 8 children, all gone in a single attack.
It's almost impossible to absorb. Who spoke at the service to try to comfort the families?
Bishop Bernard Kimball of Mount Olive Baptist Church opened the service. He said, quote, in spite of how you may be feeling today, we still need to know that God is still good, end quote. Gospel singer Kim Burrell also performed and reminded the congregation that, quote, God makes no mistakes, end quote. Even in the face of such profound tragedy. ABC News noted some high-profile figures were there too, including former U.S. Representative Gabby Giffords, herself a survivor of a 2011 assassination attempt, and U.S. Representative Cleo Fields.
And local leaders as well, I imagine.
Yes, Shreveport Mayor Tom Arsenault and Councilwoman Tabitha Taylor both expressed the city's collective grief, and Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry ordered flags to be flown at half-staff across the state. After the church service, buses carried hundreds of mourners to Forest Park Cemetery West, where the children were laid to rest. As the caskets were interred, mourners reportedly shouted, "Take care of our babies," while placing roses on the 8 white caskets.
Ethan, I understand the mothers of these children survived, but were seriously injured. What can you tell us about them?
That's right, Grace. 3 mothers were left physically and emotionally shattered. According to the Washington Post and The Guardian, all 3 were seated in the front row during yesterday's service. Shaniqua Pugh, who was the wife of the shooter and was actually seeking a divorce at the time of the attack, was shot 9 times. She attended the funeral in a wheelchair after undergoing multiple surgeries.
9 times. That's almost unbelievable that she survived. What about the other mothers?
Christina Snow was the first person attacked. She survived being shot multiple times, and remarkably, a bullet remains lodged in her face because doctors determined removal was too risky. The Washington Post reports she continues to struggle with memory loss, sometimes forgetting her children are gone. Then there's Keosha Pugh, the mother of Mark Hayden, who survived by jumping from a roof, but she sustained a broken hip and pelvis.
That's just devastating on every level. Ethan, take us back to the night of the attack itself. What happened?
The shooting occurred before dawn on April 19th, just over 3 weeks ago, in Shreveport's Cedar Grove neighborhood. Authorities cited by the Washington Post and CBS News reported that 31-year-old Shamar Elkins methodically shot the children in their beds across 2 homes. The attack was spurred by a domestic dispute. Elkins and his wife were actually scheduled for a court appearance the following day regarding their separation.
And what happened to the shooter?
Elkins fled the scene and led police on a high-speed chase into Bossier City. He died at the conclusion of the pursuit. Investigations were launched to determine whether he was killed by police fire or a self-inflicted wound, but it was confirmed he died shortly after the chase ended. And here's a critical detail, Grace. Elkins had a 2019 felony conviction for firing a weapon near a school, which means he was legally prohibited from owning a gun.
So how did a convicted felon get his hands on this weapon?
That has become the central question of the investigation. CBS News and the Houston Chronicle report that the ATF traced the firearm, a .22 caliber Mossberg 715P, to a man named Charles Ford, a 56-year-old, also a convicted felon. Investigators determined the gun had been legally purchased by a woman who then gave it to Ford in 2025. Elkins reportedly stole the weapon from under the seat of Ford's truck back in March of 2026.
And did Ford report the theft?
He did not. Ford admitted to authorities that he suspected Elkins had taken the gun but never reported it missing. On May 8th, just 2 days ago, a federal grand jury indicted Ford on charges of being a felon in possession of a firearm and making false statements to federal agents. He now faces up to 20 years in prison.
This case really highlights how many things went wrong before that night. Has this reopened the gun control debate?
Absolutely, Grace. As summarized by PBS and The Trace, this incident involved several layers of illegal activity: the illegal transfer of a gun from a legal purchaser to a felon, illegal possession by Ford, theft by Elkins, and then illegal possession by Elkins. Advocates for stricter laws point to what they call the private sale loophole, noting that the lack of universal background checks in Louisiana allowed Ford to obtain the gun initially without scrutiny. They're also pushing for safe storage laws, arguing that if Ford had been legally required to lock the weapon, Elkins might not have been able to steal it.
Has Louisiana taken any legislative action in response?
They have, but in a specific direction. The Louisiana legislature moved to pass HB 102, which expands the death penalty's eligibility for first-degree murder to include cases where the offender is legally prohibited from possessing a firearm. However, as of today, May 10th, red flag laws and mandatory safe storage bills have largely failed to gain traction in the state's Republican-controlled legislature.
So the response so far has been about punishment rather than prevention. Ethan, before we let you go, just put this into perspective for our viewers. How significant is this tragedy nationally?
Grace, this has been described as the deadliest mass shooting in the United States in over 2 years. 8 children, ranging from a 3-year-old to an 11-year-old, killed in their beds. 3 mothers left with physical and emotional wounds that may never fully heal. And a community now burying its youngest while the country once again debates how something like this could have been prevented.
Ethan, thank you for your sensitive reporting on such a difficult story. Our thoughts are with the families of the Eternal 8 this morning. We'll be right back after this. We're following a major development out of Los Angeles this morning, where a plea deal in a horrific 2022 crash involving sheriff's recruits has just fallen apart. Joining me now is our reporter Chloe to walk us through this stunning turn of events. Chloe, good morning.
Good morning, Grace. Yes, this case took a dramatic turn just 2 days ago, on May 8, 2026. The driver, Nicholas Joseph Gutierrez, actually withdrew his guilty plea after a judge rejected what was essentially a no-jail agreement. And now, instead of wrapping up, this case is barreling toward a high-stakes trial with a brand-new medical defense at its center.
Before we get into the courtroom drama, can you remind our listeners what actually happened back in 2022?
Absolutely. On the morning of November 16, 2022, in South Whittier, California, 76 recruits from LASD Academy Class 464 were on a training run along Mills Avenue. Gutierrez, who was 22 at the time and an electrical worker from Diamond Bar, veered his Honda SUV into the wrong lane and plowed straight into the formation. According to ABC News and the Associated Press, 25 recruits were struck, and 10 of them suffered critical injuries, including severe head trauma and broken bones. It was, by every account, an absolute catastrophe.
And tragically, one of those recruits didn't survive. Tell us about him.
That's right. 27-year-old Alejandro Martinez Inzunza was among the most critically injured. He fought his injuries for 8 months before passing away in July of 2023. His name has really become central to this entire case, especially during the emotional hearings we saw this past week. Family specifically said the proposed plea deal was an insult to his memory.
Now, I understand investigators initially suspected this might have been intentional. What did they ultimately conclude?
You're right, Grace. In those first chaotic hours, authorities arrested Gutierrez on suspicion of attempted murder of peace officers. But he was released shortly after, in a year-long joint investigation by the California Highway Patrol and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department concluded he'd likely fallen asleep at the wheel on his way to work. The Journal-Gazette and U.S. News and World Report both pointed out that, for 3.5 years, this fell asleep explanation was consistent from investigators and the defense alike. In fact, Gutierrez himself told NBC4 Los Angeles in a 2022 interview, quote, "I fell asleep at the wheel. I woke up to the sound of recruits banging on the windows," end quote.
That makes the new defense we're hearing about even more striking. But first, walk me through the plea deal that just collapsed.
So back in April of 2026, just last month, Gutierrez reached an agreement with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. He pleaded guilty to 1 felony count of vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence and 9 felony counts of reckless driving causing injury. In return, he'd get an 8-year suspended prison sentence, 5 years of probation, and crucially, no immediate jail time. That last piece is what really set off the families.
And then the judge stepped in. What happened in court 2 days ago?
This is where it gets remarkable. At the sentencing hearing on May 8th, Superior Court Judge Laura Walton listened to more than a dozen crash victims and their families speak. They called the deal a slap on the wrist and an insult to Alejandro's memory. Judge Walton then refused to honor the no-jail terms, telling Gutierrez and his attorney Alexandra Kazarian that she'd only approve the plea if it included a 365-day term in county jail. Faced with that, Gutierrez exercised his right under California law and withdrew his plea entirely.
So now we're heading to trial, and I understand the defense has shifted its entire theory of the case?
Yes, and this is the most significant legal development. Almost immediately after the plea collapsed, Kazarian introduced a new claim that Gutierrez was suffering from a, quote, previously undiagnosed neurological disorder, end quote, specifically a seizure disorder, at the time of the crash. The defense is now calling this a medical emergency, rather than negligence or fatigue. That's a complete pivot from the story we've heard for nearly 4 years.
Why does that change matter so much legally?
It matters enormously, Grace. Under California's Calcrum Jury Instruction 3425, unconsciousness, also known as automatism, is what's called a complete defense. If a jury finds a defendant wasn't conscious of their actions because of a physical condition like a seizure, they can't be held criminally liable at all. It targets the voluntary act element of a crime. So we're not talking about a reduced sentence here, we're potentially talking about a full acquittal.
That's a huge leap from what he could have faced. But the timing of this diagnosis raises some eyebrows, doesn't it?
It really does, and that skepticism is being voiced by major outlets. As reported by CBS News and the Los Angeles Times, there's no public record of any seizure or neurological event being mentioned to investigators, to medical staff, or to the DMV between November of 2022 and early 2026. The diagnosis only surfaced after a jail sentence was put on the table. And again, Gutierrez's own words to NBC4 back in 2022 were that he fell asleep, not that he had any kind of medical episode.
Is there any medical basis at all for a delayed diagnosis like this?
There actually is, to be fair. Medical literature, like studies in the Lancet Neurology, acknowledges that something called post-traumatic epilepsy can manifest years after a brain injury. And researchers note that patients who experience seizures often construct a logical narrative, like falling asleep to fill in memory gaps. So scientifically, it's not impossible. But for the defense to actually succeed at trial, they'd have to prove the seizure was unforeseeable.
And what does unforeseeable mean in this context?
Great question. Essentially, if the prosecution can show that Gutierrez had prior warning signs, things like dizzy spells or so-called microsleeps, and he chose to get behind the wheel anyway, he can still be found guilty of gross negligence. So the defense isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. It really hinges on whether he had any reason to suspect something like this could happen. That's going to be the battleground.
Speaking of battles, how is the district attorney's office responding to all this?
The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Michael Blake, is moving aggressively to challenge the defense claim. They've requested an independent medical expert to review Gutierrez's records and potentially conduct what's called an independent medical examination, or IME. They'll be looking for objective markers, things like scarring on a high-resolution MRI or abnormal electrical activity on an EEG. The goal is to determine whether this diagnosis is medically legitimate or whether it's, in their view, a litigation-induced tactic that conveniently appeared right when jail time became real.
When are we expecting the next major court date?
Gutierrez is scheduled to return to the Norwalk courthouse for a pretrial hearing on August 26, 2026, so a little over 3 months from today. That hearing will likely focus on discovery disputes, especially around the disclosure of his medical records. If the case ultimately proceeds to a full trial, the burden will be on the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt either that Gutierrez was conscious at the time of the crash or that his medical emergency was foreseeable and therefore negligent.
And what's the reaction been from the families and from law enforcement leadership?
There's a real sense of relief, Grace, even with all the uncertainty ahead. Victims, their families, and former Sheriff Alex Villanueva have all expressed relief that the, quote, sweetheart deal, end quote, was rejected. But they also know this is far from over. The case is now entering a much more complex phase of medical and legal maneuvering, and a trial like this could stretch well into next year. For families who've already waited 3.5 years, that's a difficult reality.
It really is an extraordinary case, and we'll be watching closely as that August hearing approaches. Chloe, thank you so much for breaking this all down for us.
My pleasure, Grace. We'll keep following every development.
Here are some other headlines. World Health Organization Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus has arrived in Tenerife to give residents a clean bill of confidence before the MV Hondius makes its grand entrance this Sunday. Carrying approximately 147 people, the cruise ship has been navigating a hantavirus outbreak, but the Director General is making sure everyone is on board with the facts, insisting this is not another pandemic sequel. While the trauma of 2020 still lingers, officials say the public health risk is floating at an all-time low. Spanish Health Minister Mónica García is steering an unprecedented operation to shuttle passengers from 23 different nations through a strictly cordoned corridor in the industrial port of Granadilla. This high-stakes logistical puzzle must be completed within a narrow 48-hour weather window to ensure the Andes strain, the only one capable of jumping from person to person, doesn't find a new host to hang out with. Turning to international security, the death toll in northwest Pakistan has climbed after a coordinated assault left 14 police officers dead. The attack on the Fatehkhel police post in the Banu district began late Saturday when a suicide bomber decided to drive his point home by ramming an explosives-laden vehicle into the facility, causing the roof to cave in. Regional police officer Sajjad Khan confirmed that the initial blast was followed by a 2-hour firefight where militants from Ittihad-ul-Mujahideen Pakistan, a splinter group that is really just an offshoot of the old bloc, used quadcopter drones to get a bird's-eye view of the ambush. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is condemning the violence as regional tensions reach a fever pitch on the anniversary of last year's clashes, further straining the relationship between Islamabad and Kabul. In West Jakarta, the House didn't win for 321 foreign nationals arrested in a massive sweep of an international online gambling syndicate. Indonesian police are dealing a heavy hand to cybercrime, seizing passports and computers after finding the group was running at least 75 digital domains. With 228 Vietnamese and 57 Chinese citizens in the shuffle, Brigadier General Wira Satya Triputra confirmed that 275 of them are now suspects under the criminal codes of 2023 and 2026. This operation is part of President Prabowo Subianto's security program, as these illicit networks are betting on Indonesia after shifting their operations away from Cambodia. Global conflicts are fueling a serious power struggle in Bangladesh, where the economy is feeling the heat from the ongoing tension between Iran, Israel, and the United States. With supply lines in the Persian Gulf hitting a snag, fuel rationing has residents waiting in line for a spark of hope, while garment factory output has taken a 30 to 40% dip. Finance Minister Amir Khosrow Mahmood Chowdhury is looking for $800 million in monthly loans to keep the lights on, as the World Bank warns that growth might stall out at 3.9%. The conflict also threatens the $30 billion annual lifeline provided by 8 million migrant workers in the Middle East. Even as a fragile ceasefire tries to take root, a cargo ship catching fire off the coast of Qatar today shows that maritime trade is still in deep water. Finally, investigators digging for the truth in the Kristen Smart case have wrapped up their search at an Arroyo Grande property without finding her remains. While the search did not yield a body, Sheriff Ian Parkinson says the ground-penetrating radar provided some dirty secrets, showing scientific evidence that human remains were once present in the crawlspace of the home owned by Susan Flores. Though the physical digging has reached a dead end for now, the investigation into the mother of convicted killer Paul Flores is far from buried, as forensic teams analyze soil samples to finally put this 30-year mystery to rest. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.